think it's definitely, first of all, the COVID crisis has absolutely been a wake-up call to the world and to the business community. I think we know how fragile the global economy is to a natural event, and COVID has brought that home to us all. In terms of a sustainable recovery, I think I'd address it on two fronts. Firstly, the economic/commercial angle, and then secondly, the climate angle. What I'm seeing is supply chains are definitely changing. Diversification of supply chain is a reality of what we've just been through on COVID. And with diversification of supply chains, I think it brings new challenges to the trade architecture. For a long countries were going down a bilateral route because they felt it easier to get bilateral trade agreements agreed rather than going through multilateral or regional agreements. But the more that you diversify your supply chain, I think the more dependent you are on the multilateral or regional trade system. I think it's important we revert back to allow supply chains to be truly diversified. It's important to be able to tap into multilateral trade agreements. I did some research many years ago about the usage of bilateral trade agreements between countries, particularly by the smaller and mid-sized businesses involved in supply chain. And the take-up rate of bilateral agreements by those smaller and mid-sized businesses was very low. The take-up rate of multilateral trade agreements was much, much higher. So I think as supply chains diversify, in light of the issues that people have faced in COVID, I think we're going to need more multilateral regional trade agreements rather than bilateral. The other economic reality of COVID is there are companies going to be emerging from the crisis with a higher debt burden. And yet the recovery in itself will create cash flow pressures for many of those businesses. And those cash flow pressures will be evident in the supply chain. As recovery picks up, their demand for cash and their pressure on their working capital will increase. And I think we, the financial services sector, but also I think governments around the world need to acknowledge that the recovery will also be painful, not just the crisis of the supply chain providers. And I think there are certain industries that are fundamentally going to have to reshape themselves and will need investment. If I turn to climate, there's a great report just been published by BCG titled Net Zero Challenge, the Supply Chain Opportunity. And that draws it back to, we all focus on the big manufacturers of the world and what are they going to do to meet climate objectives. But that report draws attention to the fact that actually 80% of their emissions actually comes from their supply chain. So we have to work collectively across the whole supply chain to address the climate agenda. And that supply chain is global today. So we have to work cross-border and cross-boundary on driving down the emissions, not just from the manufacturers, but from the supply chain of the manufacturers. I'd encourage everyone to look at that report. And that will require investment, but it will also require disclosure and reporting, because there isn't one part of the supply chain that can fulfill the obligation of the Paris Accord. It's the totality, and all of the supply chain needs to buy in transparency and disclosure requirements associated with climate. But I'll pause at that.
And just to come back briefly, because I know you're going to be involved in a group of businesses talking to the UK government about the post-Brexit regulatory environment more broadly. And I'm just interested, there has been a lot of talk about deregulation in response to Brexit here in the UK, but broadening it out, it feels like quite an old-fashioned response and an approach. It seems like a plan for a previous era to talk about deregulation as the way to build back better, when many people are actually wanting a more purposive, a more muscular approach for government and to achieve some of these objectives. So I just wonder, do you think deregulation should be part of building back better?
I must confess the dialogue I'm having, I had some dialogue with the Chancellor along with some other financial institutions just the other day. The purpose wasn't the purpose was about economic recovery and creating economic energy post-COVID, post-Brexit, and looking at barriers to economic recovery, and if regulation to a degree is a barrier, then have a dialogue about it. But it wasn't, the purpose wasn't about deregulation. The purpose of that dialogue wasn't about deregulation. It was about driving the economy forward post-COVID, and economic recovery was the purpose, and whatever was needed to pursue recovery was on the agenda for discussion. So I turn it around the other way, to be honest, Stephanie.
Okay. So Executive Vice President Dombrovskis, if we think of, you've already mentioned, or we've mentioned that the Biden administration and how that may change the feel of many of these discussions. China is a key question mark about how the US is now going to be approaching its relationship with China, and crucially where the Europe fits into that. I'm struck, the EU obviously has just forged the investment deal with China. You know, how does that fit into Brussels' broader approach to Beijing?
As regards EU relations with China, as concerns economy, there is certain asymmetry which we need to address. It is true that EU's market is much more open to Chinese companies, to Chinese investment, than China's market is to the EU. And that was the main aim with which we negotiated comprehensive agreement on investment to address this asymmetry. And if you look at this agreement, this asymmetry is there. There are substantial new openings from China as regards level playing field, as regards market access. Also, there are substantial commitments as regards sustainable development. And from the EU side, we are mainly locking in, so to say, existing level of openness because it's substantially higher to begin with. So that's the first thing, that there is certain economic asymmetry which we need to address, and to the extent the comprehensive agreement of investment will help us to do so. Second point, EU had some kind of catching up to do. If you look at the US has already their phase 1 deal with China. Recently, regional comprehensive economic partnership was agreed in Asia with China and many other countries. So it's important, of course, for EU also to have this deal, so to say, to be on equal footing with other players. But we have to be realistic. Not that comprehensive agreement on investment will resolve all our issues with China. There are many, and we are very much looking forward also to work closely with US to address those challenges, both working in different bilaterals or trilateral formats, but also multilaterally, because when we discuss the reform of the World Trade Organization, many of the challenges which we need to address stem from the socio-economic model of China. So we need to work together with US to address those challenges and to ensure that WTO reform is actually taking place. Thank you.
And one area where clearly the Biden administration is, if at least as focused as the Trump administration, is China's intellectual property theft and the trade distorting subsidies. I just wonder briefly, do you see that as an opportunity to now work more closely with the Biden administration to address those issues? And how would that work? Is that outside the WTO? Where do you see the possibilities?
Indeed, those are concerns we are also having. To some extent, but only to some extent, they are addressed also in our comprehensive agreement on investment, because there will be disciplines on state-owned enterprises in China, transparency requirements on subsidies. There will be measures to address forced technology transfers. We also previously concluded agreement on geographic indications with China, addressing also some intellectual property aspects. But there is much more work to do, and this we can do both bilaterally, but also through adjusting the rulebook of the World Trade Organization. And this is something which we have been emphasizing very much also in previous years, but now indeed we see that we can expect more commitment also from the US side as regards WTO and as regards multilateralism.
And Minister O'Connor, I mean, it's outside China we are perhaps expecting to see even more change in the attitude to trade from the US administration. You need to make a sales job to the administration about rejoining the TPP. What's your best pitch, and how can you? Do you need to address the view for many in the US that it's not a good deal for American workers and it should be renegotiated?
If we can start, I guess, with the principle that if you don't have progress towards multilateral trade agreements and rules, then the alternative is protectionism. And I guess we saw, as a result of COVID, a tendency to go back towards protectionism. We saw immediately almost 80 countries bring in 100 new restrictions on the movement of trade. We took the opposite approach. We sat down with Singapore, they were the facilitators, and said to a few like-minded countries, look, what do we need now? And obviously the issue of medical equipment was one of the things that we agreed to not bring in any restrictions for. So that enabled all of those countries to have access, as each of us was able, to access the same medical equipment. Now, we think that that's the way forward. We have always been part of multilateral trade agreements on the basis that while the WTO is 164 countries, that's an ambitious target for any other agreement. But if you start with those who have like-minded objectives, it has been with CPTPP, with RCEP, we remember, and a signatory to that, and with the Agreement on Climate Change, Trade and Sustainability, we didn't seek to get an agreement across the globe, but we did say to like-minded countries, can we start? What are the things that we agree on? And if we leave the door open for other countries when they reach that space of agreement, then they are open to join the agreements. And so that's the way that we will move forward. In terms of the US CPTPP, look, we're supportive of any countries that want to sit down, understand the rules and what the agreement says. And if they can, come so far as to meet most of those rules, then that's great. So open plurilateral trade agreements is what we will always advocate for. The WTO, of course, is rules across all of the 164. It will be hard to get any other agreements, and indeed just to get some reform and some commitment to retain the WTO is where we want to go. But in the meantime, particularly in areas like climate change, environmental sustainability, labour issues, we'll work to incorporate them into trade agreements, multilateral ones, with like-minded countries wherever possible.
And that comment about the WTO and indeed your concept of the open plurilateralism, I guess that is in a sense a contrary position to what Executive Vice President Dombrovskis was saying. If you have something really crucial, for example, this issue of intellectual property theft or China's particular contribution to the subsidies problem, that the WTO is not necessarily going to be your best route. Would you say that?
Well, that's true, but I guess if we focus on the particular issues where we have a concern and block progress on what otherwise would be agreement, then we get stuck. And I guess that we've always, and there are always parts of our agreements that have left to be side letters, to be incorporated into side letters of agreements, or left for future negotiations. I guess we don't and have never perceived agreements to cover each and every concern and ambition that we have. Can I just say very briefly, we as a trading nation, we've still had to embark upon what we call a trade for all agenda. We've had to go around our communities convincing them of the value of trade, so we can understand in other countries, that may be a harder task, but ultimately, if we rely on local production, on protectionism, and hope that we can move forward in the world, then that will be impossible. So we have to sell the concept of the value of trade to our communities as well as to our business sector.
And Noel Quinn, I mean, this question of the relationship with China, hangs over many of these conversations. China's President Xi this week did warn against the emergence of a new Cold War. I just wonder, as the head of a company with so much at stake in the global system, but specifically also in the ties with Asia. How much do you fear? How seriously do you take the idea of a new Cold War? And how would you want to see relations with China proceed coming out as we move into a new administration?
Well, Stephanie, first, I'm a banker. I'm not a politician. So, the perspective of a banker that finances trade, you know that our history is for 155 years is been involved essentially in supply chain financing. That's what we started out as an institution, connecting the world to each other so that they can trade. So I'm a strong advocate of trade. I'm a strong advocate of world trade. I'm also a realist in that trade has changed many times over our 155-year history. And I think COVID has definitely initiated a further change and diversification. I think people have been concerned about an over-concentration on any one source of manufacturing, whether that may be within China or it may be elsewhere. And therefore, I think supply chains are diversifying and bringing elements of their supply chain closer to home. But I do not believe that it's realistic to bring the totality of that supply chain back home. I think we will always be, even going forward, a world where global trade is part of our architecture. But the nature of it may change. It may become less concentrated, but it will still be a global trade system. And therefore, I am an advocate of multilateral approaches to trade. I am an advocate of that. What I'm also seeing is a change in commerce. COVID has meant that e-commerce has become a much more important part of our economy going forward than it has been in the past. And the trade system needs to, and the WTO need to understand how we're going to adapt our multilateral trade agreements for the world of e-commerce cross-border. And I know that's a topic that's been worked on quite extensively, but I think that need will become even greater. And the other thing that is absolutely critical is, even in the middle of a crisis, the climate agenda has become even more urgent, and therefore the pressure on the supply chain participants to prove their sustainability from a climate perspective is increasing even in a crisis. And the need for investment, the need for an audit trail of sustainability, of proof that actually you're able to meet the expectations of the Paris, that is growing by the day. And I think we have to realize that is going to be part of future supply chain management going forward more than it has been in the past. So I'm a strong advocate of trade. China will still be an absolutely important part of that trade cycle. I hope that natural dialogue will be the underpinning of how we move forward. The only final comment I'd put on trade, it's not just about where you manufacture, it's about how you manage logistics. And many markets that are successful are not only good at manufacturing, they're good at logistics management as well. The world needs to acknowledge that as supply chains change, they need to invest not only in manufacturing capacity, but logistics capacity.
Beatrice, just following up on that, on the question of supply chains. I mean, I noticed, I'm as head of Bloomberg Economics, I have reporters around the world, but also economists. And we had at the beginning of the pandemic, there was a lot of talk about supply chains regionalizing, bringing home, a very different shape for the global economy, globalization coming out of this. And then what we saw on the ground was actually a determination by companies to remain with the supply chains that they had, much more stickiness perhaps than people were discussing. how much do you think that supply chains have been changed by the last year? And I think I would also want you to respond to some of what Noel Quinn said on that subject.
You're absolutely right. The first phase of the pandemic last year, when trade, by the way, was falling off a cliff, and countries were closing borders not only to people movement, but also to goods, when we had daily reports of some kind of restriction on the movement of medical equipment, medicines, etc. That was also the time when there was most pessimism about the system, the trade system, and supply chains. And however, when you look at what happened afterwards, already by September, after the world trade fell by almost as much as in the global financial crisis, but within 2 months last year, and had fully recovered by September, and now we are running at full speed, and that and services trade is still below that, but goods trade has really fully recovered, and the fact that the world has masked up has a lot to do with the fact that trading routes are open, and that the fear of large-scale closures did not really materialize, and also when companies saw demand come back more quickly than they expected middle of last year, they really used their existing supply chains and back up their capacity. So the long term or the fears that value chains would completely change in the short term, that I think has been pretty much averted. But there is, of course, a need, and that also goes back to the question of what can the multilateral trading system do, what should the WTO do now. They have to prove now, or we have to prove now, that in fact, protectionism, vaccine nationalism, limits to export restrictions, and liberalization, movement of critical medical supplies are not going to be the order of the day. And a memorandum of understanding to this effect could be a first step to later possibly a fully fledged binding accord in this area. That would also be something that is of most immediate impact, and something that the WTO could engage in. And then it needs to, and this has, here I'm echoing what others have said too, is we have to find ways to address the new challenges, be it climate change, but even more so digital service trade. The fact that during this and after this pandemic, we can expect so much more cross-border telecommuting taking place, and this may become a new development model for the poorer countries, that they export services that do not really cross the border themselves. This has been accelerated by at least 10 years within the last year. So the whole question of the digital economy, e-commerce to telecommuting, to all the questions that it relates to, namely data location, privacy, these are all big topics, and they need to, the forum need to be reopened or accelerated to discuss these. And even on the last one, where there is most pessimism, where there is the question of really the clash of systems, when it comes to the question, is it China versus US? If we are talking about industrial subsidies and how to treat state-owned enterprises, then there are technical questions there that are also relevant within advanced countries. There are technical solutions to that too. But there needs to be transparency, and most of all, there needs to be a certain level of trust. Without rebuilding trust in the global system and among the key players, it will be difficult to advance. But again, we have a chance now to use this catastrophe which the COVID pandemic has caused to realize that trust and common concerns are crucial for global solutions.
Well, and Beatrice has raised a very important point, which I think we have, I didn't think we could avoid discussing this week, because it may be actually the greatest, the most imminent challenge to the global trading system is the question of vaccine nationalism. And there's certainly a lot of question marks, a lot of pressures now on the EU position. Executive Vice President Dombrovskis, it is not a positive contribution to the future of trade and trust in global systems if the EU starts to restrict exports of COVID-19 vaccines, is it?
As regards vaccines, indeed, they are now important to ensure that vaccines are available, and that vaccines are available across the world, including to the developing countries, and EU is fully committed to play its part to ensure that this is happening. So all in all, EU has ordered some 2.3 billion doses of vaccines, not only with a view for EU's own needs, but also to cover to help the neighborhood and to help the developing countries. So what we are discussing now, and there is a decision in preparation later for today, is a time-limited system to ensure indeed a clarity on production and exports in the EU, because unfortunately not all pharmaceutical companies has acted in a spirit of full transparency with the EU, and we must of course ensure that companies are meeting their contractual obligations, but we are not talking here export bans or export restrictions, and it only concerns advanced purchase agreements and humanitarian needs. COVAX facility, which is there for developing countries, neighborhood, and so on, they are fully exempted. So clearly EU is ready to do its contribution to ensure that the vaccines are available across the world, and we hope that also other developed countries will do the same. Thank you.
So you would rule out, and you would agree it would be counterproductive and very costly for the EU to set the example of restricting exports of vaccines.
Exactly, and that's why I outlined this time-limited system as it's being designed right now, and the fact that we need to ensure full clarity and full transparency, and we need to ensure that pharmaceutical companies are fulfilling their obligations.
Minister O'Connor, just briefly on this question, I mean, how is New Zealand handling the rollout of the vaccine, and how concerned are you about what was described this week as a potential moral failure of a massive gap in the provision of vaccines between rich and poor countries?
Look, we are very concerned for the developing countries and where they see their inability to get access. And we understand, of course, the need for ongoing investment as this rolls through. We'll be looking very carefully at the situation in terms of we are not one of the early countries to take up the vaccine. We will start to roll it out over the next couple of months, so we're in a lucky position, but the developing countries have every right to be concerned that they might be blocked. And so the TRIPS agreement and the principles behind that are something that does have to be taken on board. It emphasises once again the importance of not just trade, but the rules of trade and the openness required among us all if we are to be fair across the globe. And this is an acute issue that will have to be worked through, but there will be many others as we roll forward on climate change, on other environmental objectives. So New Zealand will be watching this very, very carefully and advocating, as always, for fair and open trade, particularly in this area of vaccine.
And I had, I think, time only really for one final question. And I thought, if the other panelists will forgive me, I wanted to come back to Executive Vice President Dombrovskis, because we have many active policy issues facing the EU. We've talked about lots of grand challenges, major issues, digital taxation and how to bring the digital world into the global trading system, climate, all of these new challenges. And yet we have, coming out of the Trump administration, an overhang of existing disputes, including, for example, the 17-year Boeing Airbus dispute. I wonder, how do you think it's important to get past to resolve some of these issues, maybe also the tariffs that President Trump had put on steel and aluminum? Do you think that those things have to be resolved before we can get round the table on these other issues, or do you think it's possible to leave those as they are and still move ahead with the new administration?
From EU side, we consider, of course, that it's important to resolve those issues. So the steel and aluminium tariffs, which had been unilaterally imposed by US, and EU had to react by imposing its own tariffs, and also tariffs now imposed in line with the Airbus-Boeing dispute. So as regards specifically Airbus-Boeing dispute, our proposal remains on table. We are ready to withdraw or to suspend these tariffs any time. Of course, this has to be mutual withdrawal or suspension. And we are ready to negotiate the disciplines, future disciplines in the area of civil aviation. Because also there may be new competitors emerging, so it's important that EU and US work together in this area. So we discuss what the disciplines in the area of civil aviation should be, forward-looking, and we put this Airbus-Boeing dispute behind us.
And can I just ask, have you had conversations? Has there been dialogue with the incoming Biden administration on that issue?
Well, clearly, we are reaching out to the Biden administration on this. We actually had discussions also with the previous administration. Unfortunately, we were not able to arrive at the conclusions, so we hope for a more cooperative approach of the new administration. And indeed, we think that these issues should be settled in a relatively short time.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you to all of the panelists. I know with questions of global trade, we can start off with very lofty discussions and major issues, but it also often just comes down to brass tacks of individual disputes and problem solving. And as Beatriz Vedemiro said, it's the most important thing often is trust as well as cooperation. So thank you to all of you. I'm Stephanie Flanders, and I thank Executive Vice President Dombrovskis, Noel Quinn, Beatriz Vedemiro, and Damien O'Connor. Thank you for joining us.